Welcome to The Explainer. If you think you know exactly how the era of the Wild West closed, well, you might want to rethink your timeline. Today, we're dusting off a century-old cold case to uncover why the legendary final chapter of Butch Cassidy might actually be a complete historical fabrication. Seriously, the paper trail left behind tells a story that is far stranger and, honestly, far more modern than any fiction.
We've all heard the Hollywood version of that final shootout in South America, right? It's that brilliant cinematic freeze frame of Butch and the Sundance Kid going out in a blaze of glory against absolutely overwhelming odds. It's perfectly poetic. But what if the history books got it completely wrong? What if the men who died in that dusty Bolivian courtyard weren't who the authorities thought they were at all?
Okay, let's dive right into this because newly uncovered detective files and modern forensic science are painting a completely different picture. We are going to look closely at the actual manhunt documents from the very people who hunted him, the high-tech forensic science applied to his supposed grave, and the imposters who tried to claim his legendary name. We want to see if the Wild West's greatest escape artist managed to pull off one last impossible trick. To understand the escape, we really have to understand the man. Born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866 to a Mormon pioneer family in Utah, he eventually took the name Butch Cassidy and formed the notorious Wild Bunch. And they were not just some random group of drifters. They used the impenetrable Robbers' Roost in Utah as their ultimate hideout. It was basically a geographical fortress so rugged and full of steep, narrow slot canyons 50 miles from anywhere that pursuing lawmen literally couldn't find them. It gave them the perfect, untouchable base of operations. From that impenetrable fortress, they launched a historically unprecedented, rapidly escalating crime spree. Just think about the sheer audacity of these strikes. Take Montpelier, for example. A local historian noted it happened on August 13th, exactly 13 minutes after 3 p.m., right after a $13 deposit was made. I mean, they were meticulous. Then came Castlegate and the Wilcox train robbery, which netted up to $50,000. With each strike, the gang grew bolder, the bounties on their heads grew massive, and they became absolute national celebrities. Now, this is where history pivots. You have the gang using Old West tactics, like hidden canyons and secret trails, running headfirst into the birth of the modern surveillance state, which was pioneered by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It created this incredible friction between Old World mobility and New World information. The outlaws knew the open country better than anyone, but the detectives understood how to track movement, money, and memory across state lines. You really have to think of the Pinkertons as the 19th century equivalent of the FBI and Interpol combined. They weren't just local sheriffs riding around on horseback, they were a massive, sophisticated network of data. By the end of the 19th century, they had over 2,000 full-time agents. If you robbed a train in Wyoming, your description wasn't just staying in Wyoming. It was being telegraphed to bankers, railroad agents, and marshals nationwide. It was literally the birth of modern long-range pursuit. But then, in a moment of pure outlaw ego, the gang made a fatal mistake. They sat for a studio portrait in Texas. They literally handed the Pinkertons the exact faces they needed to distribute to banks and railroads worldwide. The agency called this the bad luck photo for a very good reason. It was a total breakthrough. Before this, they were chasing rumors and rough descriptions. Now, they had high-quality images of 5 Wild Bunch members, sharply dressed and completely legible to the modern surveillance machine. Imagine the paranoia that sets in after that. Feeling the intense pressure of the pursuit, Butch, the Sundance Kid, and Etta Place fled to Argentina. They bought land in Patagonia, crossed an ocean to step out of the outlaw life, and really tried to just disappear. But the Pinkerton machine was absolutely relentless. The agency intercepted a letter Sundance sent back to his family. Suddenly, wanted circulars featuring that Fort Worth photo were popping up in South America, forcing them to run across the Andes into Chile and eventually Bolivia. And this brings us to the supposed grand finale. 1908, San Vicente, Bolivia. 2 English-speaking bandits robbed an Aramayo mine payroll and were cornered by soldiers in a deadly standoff. The bandits barricaded themselves in a small, dark boarding house. A fierce gunfight erupted, and by the next morning, the authorities found 2 dead bodies inside. The official story locked this in as the definitive end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But let's look a little closer at the paperwork. When you actually read the historical inquests from the time, the official story just starts to crumble. The evidence was shockingly thin. The local authorities never definitively identified the dead men as Butch and Sundance. No photos were taken of the bodies to confirm their identities. The diplomatic paperwork summarized the dead simply as two unknowns. In fact, a witness to the initial robbery had only seen the masked men's eyes. That neat cinematic ending we all accept today, it was incredibly flimsy in the original documents.
And get this, even William A. Pinkerton, the head of the agency that spent a fortune hunting them down, blatantly dismissed the San Vicente's story as, quote, fake. Think about that for a second. The very people whose entire job it was to catch these men absolutely refused to close the book on them based on two unidentified bodies in a Bolivian cemetery.
The smoking gun here isn't a bullet. It's the data. The Pinkertons didn't close the case in 1908. Decades after the supposed shootout, these files stayed active. We're talking gang correspondence going into 1924. Butch's file has entries in 1921. Etta Place's file was receiving updates in 1940. If these outlaws were definitively dead, there is no way the agency would have spent thousands of dollars generating active paperwork and logging sightings for another 30 years.
The professional pursuit, the suspicion, the active rumor checking, it all continued globally. They weren't hunting men anymore. They were hunting ghosts. In 1913, a man was detained in La Paz because they thought he was Butch. In 1921, Pinkerton claimed Sundance was jailed in Peru, while Butch had slipped back to Argentina. Meanwhile, Cassidy's sister, Lula, claimed her brother actually visited the family years later and died peacefully in the American Northwest in 1937.
So you might be wondering, if the real Butch Cassidy was still out there, who was the man wandering around the West in the 1920s claiming to be him? Well, this leads us to a Spokane businessman named William Phillips. He began circulating in the West, sparking these wild claims that he was the legendary outlaw returned from exile. Phillips started visiting old Wild Bunch haunts in Wyoming, meeting with old-timers who supposedly recognized him, and spinning this incredibly elaborate tale of survival.
Now, Phillips had an uncanny knowledge of the gang. He wrote a manuscript full of intimate details and even had Cassidy's unique brand on his gun. But actually, scratch that. Modern research has completely debunked this imposter. When historians really dug in, they found out that Phillips was sitting in a Wyoming prison at the exact same time as the real Butch Cassidy was out robbing trains. Plus, facial analysis showed Phillips had a completely different head shape and jawline. He wasn't Butch. He was just an incredibly dedicated fanboy with a really good memory. To solve the physical mystery of those Bolivian graves once and for all, we have to leave the dusty history books behind and step into a high-tech modern lab. Investigators turn to forensic anthropology and a very specific type of genetic tracking, mitochondrial DNA. This is incredibly useful because it survives in old bones much better than regular nuclear DNA. And since it's passed down unbroken from a mother, it allows scientists to directly compare historical remains to living relatives today. So, scientists excavated the graves in San Vicente, bringing over a century of rumors right down to a single genetic test. And the mitochondrial DNA extracted from those bones absolutely did not match. The forensic anthropology simply doesn't support the legend. The men buried in that dusty cemetery, the ones who went down in that famous shootout, were not Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. While the men seemingly vanished into history, their stolen loot, including gold from Castle Gate and silver in Irish Canyon, remains hidden somewhere out there along the Outlaw Trail. We are talking about massive fortunes still stashed away. So, if you've got a metal detector and a free weekend, the remote canyons of Utah might be calling your name. Treasure hunters literally still scour the regions around Robber's Roost, looking for the buried remnants of the Wild Bunch's incredible crime spree, but it remains entirely unfound to this day.
So the Pinkerton files show a chase that faded into shadows, not bullets. The bones in South America belong to someone else entirely. It's totally possible that Robert Leroy Parker pulled off the greatest trick of all, watching his own legend die while he quietly walked away. It leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on. Which requires more brilliance, pulling off the perfect crime or orchestrating the perfect death so you can live out your days in total peace? Keep questioning the history you've been taught, and we'll see you on the next explainer.